little bit chilling. I know that the blood pressure, certainly amongst parents, is raised a little bit. The good news is that Jewish life on campus is also very rich, and those of you preparing to apply or to go to college this fall have 4 great years ahead of you, and I don't want this to take away from anything that that awaits you when you go off on the next chapter of your lives. But we in the Jewish community, certainly at our federation, believe that it is incumbent upon us as adults, as Jewish leaders, to educate the next generation to be prepared for what you may encounter when you get to school. You will discover all the richness of life that Hillel and Chabad and all the Jewish organizations will be providing you when you get there. Before you get there, we believe it is important for you to be ready, to be prepared, and we are doing what we can starting today and including all the programming that Federation provides so that you can be ready, aware, and hopefully for some of you standing up and leading the pro-Israel organizations when you get to college and today as well in your high schools. So with that, I want to introduce our keynote speaker, Rachel Fish, who is Zooming in today from Boston. Rachel's resume is long and impressive, and I'm going to follow up today by sending that out to you along with some articles that she's written. She has been engaged in education and standing up, I would say even before she was at Columbia and at Harvard. She was born and raised in Tennessee. She is deeply connected and committed to the state of Israel, has been involved in teaching about how to combat anti-Semitism. Today, Dr. Fish is the co-founder of Boundless, which is a think tank and an action tank, partnering with community leaders to revitalize Israel education and take collective action to combat Jew hatred. She is particularly adept in teaching how to combat anti-Semitism in the place where we live, ladies and gentlemen, on social media, on your phones. And so she's going to speak to you today about how to engage, and equally as important, when to engage, because not in every situation must we fight back. We need to be smart and strategic about how we do that. So Rachel is going to start her presentation. We're going to open it up to Q&A, 20 minutes in, so that you can ask her all the questions that you want. Following Rachel's presentation, we'll be going into breakout rooms, we'll be having lunch, we'll finish up with our final speaker, Rachel Fish, zooming in from Boston. The floor is now yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Linda, and thank you for inviting me to be a participant in today's conversation. I was listening to the film. I couldn't see it, but I know the film very well. And I just want to reiterate what Linda said, which is not every campus is burning. And there are real opportunities to have very positive experiences on college campus as a Jew, as a Zionist. And when challenges emerge, you need to be prepared and you need to have a sense of sort of the ecosystem of the university. And that's part of the skills that you're developing through the work that you're doing today and through the programs that you've been participating in. I'm going to share my screen. And as Linda said, the focus of our conversation is going to be related to the conversation around social media. And you all know that what you see on social media is highly curated. It is based upon algorithms that you have zero control over. Social media itself is created for the purpose of exacerbating emotional responses. And we know this not only from the algorithms, we know this from what we have learned from the professionals who work with these social media companies. This is not a component of the work of social media that is focused just on creating informed, fully comprehensive understanding. You get a slice of a picture. and it's like a picture frame. You don't have a sense of what is behind that picture frame. And so now the purpose here is to understand, how do you put what you see online into that context? So let's just start with a very old cartoon. This cartoon actually came out years ago during the Second Intifada in 2001. And what you see in this cartoon is an image of an Israeli soldier. And here in this image, the soldier has his foot on the back of a Palestinian woman. And looking into the mirror, it is a reflection for the Israeli soldier to be depicted as a Nazi, and the Nazi pointing the gun at a Jew during the period of the Holocaust. And so there's this suggestion that now the Israelis, the IDF, are the new Nazis. These are the kinds of images that you will see sometimes in very explicit ways, sometimes in less obvious ways, in which you have to be able to understand that context. We saw last May 2021, a year ago, during the conflict between Israel and Hamas, that many pop culture celebrities, artists, musicians, actors, and actresses decided that they themselves needed to give a position on what was happening between Israelis and Palestinians. And once again, in this particular situation, you don't actually, and they don't actually, position the conversation with all of its context, and that's not the purpose. What is happening here is that it is a simplification, a flattening of the complexity for the purpose of being able to transpose a simple lens that is taken from the American experience and placed onto the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So you see that, for example, Halsey, who's a musician, writes, "It's not too complicated to understand. Brown children are being murdered. People are being displaced under the occupation of one of the most powerful armies in the world. It is willful ignorance to conflate these simple horrors with religion and geopolitics." Now, why this matters is because for so many young people, these individuals have enormous influence. And for the majority of young people, they are not invested in this conversation, Jews and non-Jews, about Israel and its relationship and the conflict with Palestinians. And most are what we call don't knows. And even some are don't cares. And I don't say that in a negative way. It's just that this is not one of the top issues that they're focused on, either because of advocacy or intellectual curiosity. It's just not their primary interest. And so what we're trying to help think about is, when a don't know engages or sees this kind of context or sees this kind of post, how does it influence their understanding, their emotional response, and their behavior in terms of this conversation? And what we want to think about is, if we are seeing posts that have a large don't know audience, how do we positively predispose those don't knows to engage with greater complexity? So let me give you another example. During the administration of the Trump administration, this social media channel became very popular, called So You Want to Talk About. It's a very left of center channel. Some of you may know it, be familiar with it. And they posted the so you want to talk about the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And they use ethnic cleansing with a very particular usage of very loaded language that has very specific connotation. And the example they give is the Nakba, which relates to the catastrophe or the events of the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. And it gives a very narrow, particular political positioning and suggests that Israel, in its inception, is engaged in ethnic cleansing, and the proof point is the Nakba. Now, obviously, Israel was not engaged in ethnic cleansing, and we know that, of course, there is a lot of complexity for when a nation state emerges and innocent people are harmed. And Palestinians do experience a catastrophe. But that does not take into consideration any of these, and it just simply has a political agenda that lacks all of that context. We also know that there are social justice movements, many of which many of you, myself included, care deeply about, that engage with the conversation of Palestine and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in order to insert it into their own particular social justice cause and to create what is called an intersectional case, specifically around suggesting that in order to be truly progressive, part of that litmus test means that this Palestine conversation has to be included. And I would argue that we have to re-articulate the language that is being hijacked or manipulated for very clear political purposes. And we're going to come back to that in just a moment. But again, you see the kind of language that is being utilized here. So what I would like to have you all think about when you encounter these kinds of social media posts, and very often you're going to encounter them first on your devices, and then depending upon the college environment, the campus environment, you may encounter it in the school newspaper, you may encounter it with specific speakers that are invited by either student groups, sometimes even departments. You may encounter it in terms of the outside agitators who come onto college campus to create this hostile environment towards Israel and Zionism, and in some cases, even Jews. So why I say that is because what happens on these devices doesn't only stay on a social media platform, but it is this dynamic reality between what's happening on the ground and what's happening in the air, this meta, verse, this social space that we've been consumed with for far too long. So here I want to be very clear. On these devices and in some of these settings on college campuses, you are not going to have people who come to the conversation with a willingness and intention of engaging with complexity. If you are in one of those environments where you can have folks coming together who are willing to engage with the complex, muddy, difficult issues, and everyone comes in order to be able to look at very hard, challenging subjects like what does it mean to hold power? What does it mean to be both a particular nation state, and in this case, Jewish, and also have a responsibility for the universal, those who are beyond the Jewish? Those are really good conversations and ones that I hope all of you can have in a variety of settings during your college experiences. But what I have seen for far too long is not that nuanced, complex discussion where you should think about Israel with a critical lens, but rather the starting point is, does Israel have a right to exist? And the answer is no. And what I would suggest to you all is that when that is the starting point, there is something nefarious that is happening here that is ultimately suggesting that Israel is created in sin, and therefore Israel ought to be demonized, Israel ought to be dehumanized, Israel will be held to a double standard like no other nation state in the global community is held. And therefore, that's when we have to question what the motives are of these individuals, these organizations, these kinds of speakers, the posts that you may see, and call them into question. And there are different ways to do that. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. We also saw this past May, and we even see it today, that very often Jews, irrespective of their individual relationship with the state of Israel or with Zionism, are perceived as an extension of Israeli behavior and Israeli action, and therefore held responsible for the state of Israel. And we know that is a highly problematic position. It's highly problematic when that happens, for example, to Russians today, based upon Putin's actions. It's highly problematic when that happened towards Asian Americans and continues to happen because of what happened in Wuhan and what happened with the COVID virus. And we know that can lead to demonization and the targeting of particular people. And in the Jewish case, it exacerbates issues around Jew hatred. Jew hatred is anti-Semitism. So we have to be able to understand where people are entering this conversation, and if we can determine if they have this clear political agenda of delegitimizing the state and therefore all those who support the state, or if they actually want to be engaged in a meaningful, nuanced engagement. Now, part of what my message for you all is that when you are on these devices, you cannot just sit here scrolling through your accounts and abandon all of the critical thinking skills that you have been taught and honed for the past several years. You still need to be asking yourself, when you encounter a problematic post, from where is this coming? Who is writing this post? What is intended and what the post is actually stating? Is there a particular call to action? Who is the audience that's going to see this post? Are they don't knows, or are they already folks who are haters? What facts are included? What facts perhaps are marginalized? Is there a particular narrative that is being put forth? These are the kinds of questions, just like you would think about when you're reading a poem, a sonnet, if you're reading an essay, if you're reading a Jewish text, you would be asking these kinds of questions in order to better understand the agenda of the individual who is putting it out. And then, as Linda said, you really need to ask yourself, am I going to engage with this post? And if you are going to engage, you need to think carefully about how you are going to engage. And there are a variety of reasons to engage and reasons not to engage. So I will suggest to you that if it is a well-known influencer, there's really zero reason to engage, because you're not going to change the heart or mind of that particular individual. They don't even run their own social media. They have a social media manager who does that. And your perspective doesn't matter to them. And I would argue, just as it shouldn't matter to you what some pop culture celebrity or influencer thinks about these issues. It's irrelevant. They actually have no nuance. They have very little understanding of these issues. They are not experts. And I realize that influencers also do carry weight for many young people. And so it begs the question of, how do you know whether or not to respond? And I would argue that if a friend of yours posts or reshares something that an influencer wrote, that is when you need to be able to decide if you have a real relationship with that individual, to say, I'd like you to hit the pause button. And is it possible for me to explain to you that why you, what you posted or why you reshared a post by so-and-so is problematic, and see if they're willing to engage in a conversation. And that's ultimately because you know that friends who are don't knows are going to see that post, and you want to be able to move them to engage with more complexity rather than that superficiality. I also just want to say two more things, and then I'm happy to open it up to a conversation. There are plenty of individuals who post that are not necessarily humans. And we know from looking at data science, based upon the ability of technology to mine when these kinds of posts are being put out, that a lot of bots put these posts out at certain hours of the day when there is already nothing happening, or when we know there's conflict that's taking place. And so you see a lot of activity, and it's not human activity. So you engaging with that post is actually going to just elevate it in terms of the algorithm so that more people will see it, rather than it being lost in the larger noise that exists on these social media platforms. So that's an example of not posting or not engaging with what you see. The other piece of this is that we know that there are influences coming from foreign actors who also are putting content out into the social media platforms that gets picked up and utilized by a variety of actors, from social movement causes and even politicians, and also the media. And part of the work that I am involved in is trying to raise awareness and understanding about the influence of these foreign actors, so that there can be greater understanding of when that is happening, and try in some ways to inform these social media companies of this activity and determine legally and in terms of policy if there is a way to have greater oversight when that kind of activity occurs. But that is a much bigger picture that may not necessarily be at the top of your mind when you see something that's being posted. And I'm saying this to you so that you then now have that in your mind. So you have the ability to, again, hit that pause button and determine if this is actually a piece of content that you should engage with, or if your engagement is actually going to only continue to increase the way it appears on these social media platforms. The last thing I'll say is a larger framework, which is there are ways in which you want to call people into a conversation, and there are times in which you need to call out. So what do I mean by that? When you call in, you are looking to engage individuals who you may have a relationship with, so that you can sensitize them around these conversations of Judaism, Jews, the Jewish people, and the Jewish state, so that you can actually help them understand this complexity, and so that you can be in relationship with those individuals in order to build bridges beyond your own particular community, so that you help them understand and learn and build empathy in order to gain greater knowledge and understanding. And there are plenty of ways to call in, and many of you may already be doing that. And the only way that starts is through actual human relationships. So that requires you to get off these devices and actually in person, in community, so that you can build the muscles needed in order to call people in appropriately. And again, the reason to call in is because most people are not familiar with these issues. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, as Linda said, I grew up in Tennessee. I grew up in a place where people didn't know many Jews, where there were very few understanding around the complexity of Jews as an ethno-religious community, both as a religion and a people. And we had people growing up who said prayers in the name of Jesus in a public school system that had to be educated, that was a problem, that was a violation of the First Amendment. We had people who would come up to us and want to feel our heads to see where we hid our horns. We had to explain at a young age why we don't eat certain foods and why we can't attend every Friday night football game. And I know some of those things sound very mundane, but it's through those experiences of calling people in that they then have a chance to grow and learn and be exposed to those people who are different from themselves. At the same time, I will say there are opportunities in which you have to call out. When it is clear prejudice, hatred, discrimination, you need to condemn it. And you need to stand proud as a Jew in order to be able to speak clearly with a very strong spine and represent who you are, what you believe, and have the moral courage to do so, even though it may be very hard, because the larger mentality of the herd mentality around you is one that is counter to what you are saying. And it means that you may lose some friends. And what I would say is that you also have to practice standing tall and being proud of who you are. And so you have to know when to call in and when to call out. And when you aren't sure, you need to reach out to the grownups, to your religious clergy, your leaders, to your parents, in order to have that conversation and to be able to think carefully about what the best approach is. And the last thing I'll say, Linda, and then I know it's questions. If you see any kind of post or anything happening in an environment that is targeting and inciting and can lead to violence, you absolutely must report it to the police. And do not hesitate to do so, whether it's a security officer at a school, whether it's the local police, because you do not want to be in a situation in which it can lead to violence and you stayed silent. So that's also just very important. And it's about protecting the people around you and also preventing any potential heightening of tensions that may exist. So that's what I have to share in a very short period of time. And Linda, I'm happy to hear if there are any thoughts or questions.
Thank you, Rachel. I want you to know that I have been involved in this space of pro-Israel engagement, advocacy, education for the last 20 years. And you're going to hear a little bit later about a program that we want you to consider applying for in this federation catchment area. It's new, and I know it's going to speak to some of you. But I have heard everybody out there, and I want you to know that Rachel Fish is truly a treasure and a huge, huge asset to our community. She's very young, so it's going to surprise certainly the parents in here that Rachel has 4 children. She sings, we all sing lullabies or sang lullabies to our children at night. She's actually sends them to sleep singing Hatikva. I don't know if that's, part of this is growing up in Tennessee, being, I guess isolated from major Jewish population centers, but she has Israel and Zionism and commitment to the Jewish state really wired into her DNA. And she has spent many, many, many years teaching people, students and adults like those in this room today. And she's also a woman who is a tremendous role model. We don't have time for me to tell you the story, but Google Rachel Fish and you'll learn about what she did at Harvard. She is courageous, she is principled, and as I said, she is really a treasure to the Jewish people. So with that, I know you don't see us, Rachel, but there are about 40 to 45 people in this room. I want to take some questions. So we have, Mara has a microphone. I know the first question is always the hardest, so I'll ask it. And as I'm asking the question, I'm going to ask the courageous amongst you in this room to ask for the mic and ask Rachel a question yourselves. Rachel, based on your experience, do you think that anybody really, even the most eloquent, either spokesperson or writer per se, can actually move the needle in a post on social media? Can we really make a difference, online?
So I'm very clear that I don't think we can cede the space to the detractors, to the haters, because that is problematic, obviously. And I feel even just in the way you're asking the question, Linda, similarly to how you're asking the question, that a single post cannot at all in any significant way move the needle long term. First of all, what we're finding is that most Jewish organizations who use social media as part of their strategy, and most individuals who are considered Jewish influencers who are posting regularly to try to engage in social, are only speaking to the Jews. We are having zero impact beyond the Jewish community, beyond the silos and echo chambers of people who already agree with us. So we will have to figure out strategically how better to get these messages to a broader audience of non-Jews and Jews who have different perspectives and opinions than those who are already listening to those particular individuals, in order to at all significantly move the needle. And the reason you would do that and engage in that kind of strategy is because Jews need to be in relationship with a variety of other communities, because the Jewish people are very small, only 2% of the American population. And we need to be able to sensitize more people to these issues who are not aware of, engaged with, and don't fully understand or comprehend at all why these things come to the front of the conversation very often in politics, in media, both traditional and social, and in social justice movements. So that makes the case then for building those relationships with a variety of other communities so that they too can be the messengers on social and have a much bigger impact and reach than we have. But I really do not think that a single post, a single statement by anyone has long-term ability to change the way people think, the way people feel, and their actions. I think that it can be a component of a larger strategy, but it is not the silver bullet.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any hands, so let me ask a question of you. Does anybody, oh, is there somebody raising a hand? Please. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I guess my question is, what are if you could maybe talk about one of the biggest misconceptions that people get wrong when they talk about Israel, when they talk negatively about Israel. I think that's what's missing for young people is knowledge about how to respond to some of these things. In the video that we saw people at NYU getting notes slipped under their door, eviction notices. You have somebody in the video saying, well, that's not true, right? But I think people need to be armed with information. And can you talk maybe about one example that is a very common misconception that you can arm people with some information to help counter that when they hear it?
Sure, it's a very important question. I will, and I'm not suggesting the way you've positioned the question that you're saying this, but I will say this is where I really think it's very important for all of the students in the room to actually engage with the complexity and nuance of the subject matter, because simple talking points aren't going to actually help you at the end of the day. And I'll tell you why simple talking points aren't going to help you is because all someone has to do is make a quick accusation and then you're playing defense. And the facts, which trust me, as a historian, I'm trained as a historian, you see all the books on the shelves, they matter, they are deeply important, but we are living in a world where facts are debated and not believed to be objective and have truth, and rather narratives are privileged and narratives are given more weight irrespective of the facts. So you need to know that that's what sort of the playing field is like. Also, we know that, and I've seen this many, many times for the last 20 years, so many students and individuals will say to me, well, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an expert on this subject. And so therefore, I don't feel like I have the ability to speak. So here's where I will say, you need to be knowledgeable, and you need to know that sometimes your knowledge isn't going to be able to help you engage in moving the needle, because the folks that have already created a particular position have an outcome that is desired, and it is not engaging with facts. So this is where I will say, know with whom you are speaking. If you are on the campus quad and there's a die-in or a mock apartheid wall or mock checkpoints, facts aren't going to help you. Those are detractors. It may be worthwhile for the 80% of friends who were walking with you, who know nothing about the subject, but then you can engage with them in a real conversation when you're hanging out in the dorm room, when you're at your meals. But you're not going to change the people who are the ones promoting that very anti-Israel position. And I'm very clear with my language. It is not a pro-Palestinian position. It is an anti-Israel position. There are certain pieces of language that have been weaponized. So I'm not answering your question exactly because, again, a lot of this would require us to do a deep dive into the accusations that will be hurled against you. And then, of course, the facts that are used or the information that is used to counter that. But we don't live in a world in which a litigious approach is going to move the needle. So you need to understand the way language has been weaponized and the intent of that weaponization of language. So when you hear that Zionism is racism, Zionism equals apartheid, when you hear things like Israel is a settler colonialist entity, or Israel engages in ethnic genocide, your radar should go up, because ultimately that kind of language is being manipulated for a clear political purpose. And the one piece I would have you sort of retain or hold on to just in this conversation is, when nation states are born, no nation state is born in immaculate conception. Every nation state, as it comes to the fore, engages in challenging moments in history that ultimately harm another people. There is no exception to that. Israel is not an exception to that. That does not mean, however, that Israel is created in sin or Israel is tainted morally because of how it is created. And so you have to remember that, because the intent for so many individuals when they say Israel, uses ethnic genocide when it was created, that's how it comes to be, or Israel engages in settler colonialism. And the reality is they're trying to tarnish Israel's identity before you can even engage with the idea of Israel. So that's part of this conversation. The approach of, well, let me tell you what happened exactly in 1947 and 1948 and 1949. That's a conversation that has to happen with people who have an interest and an intention of thinking about complex issues. It is not going to be what ultimately happens in some of these very combative, hostile spaces.
It's a great answer. And Rachel's used language that I think behooves us to remember. And if you're not going, we're going to have to send that text out, Rachel, because I think I found it very moving. Debbie, I think you have a.
I wanted to thank you for your talk this morning. It was fabulous. But also, in kind of adding on to what you just said, you mentioned earlier this idea that you can't, what's being sort of presented on a lot of the college campuses is that you can't be pro-Israel and pro-social justice issues. So what are some, how do you deal with Israel's not perfect? Israel makes mistakes, but that doesn't mean you kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. And how do you sort of stand up and say, yes, I do believe in pick your social justice issue, but I'm also a supporter of the state of Israel?
So you're absolutely right that there's a false binary that has been created, that if you're for social justice issues, you're over here, but if you're part of Israel or the Zionist identity, then you're going to be excluded from those conversations on many campuses. And I just want to give you an example. This past summer, University of Vermont and George Washington University had student groups, not university administration involved, but student groups create a platform from the Students Against Sexual Assault organizations on campus, in which they said, if you are a Zionist, and their Zionism included all Jews in that category, you cannot be part of Students Against Sexual Assault, irrespective if you experienced sexual assault and are a victim of sexual assault, because the soldiers affiliated with the Israel Defense Forces uses as a tool sexual assault against Palestinians to harm them. And therefore, as oppressors, you, Zionists, are also associated with this oppressive reality, and you are excluded from this space. What do you do if you're a Jewish student, whether or not you're a Zionist, who cares deeply about sexual assault because you either have a friend, you've had a history with it, whatever it may be, you've been a victim of, and you're being told that your identity as a Jew and as a Zionist excludes you from that space, which has nothing to do with the Middle East, has nothing to do with Israel, but Israel has become the lightning rod for that student group. Well, I can tell you what I would do, which is I would forget that Students Against Sexual Assault organization and I would start my own. And I think that is what we have to be teaching our students to do. We have to be willing to say, we're not interested in being part of your organization or club if you seek to demonize, dehumanize, or delegitimize a nation state that has every right to exist, and you only pick on one. And instead, I'm going to create my own group that focuses on the actual issue, sexual assault, and not muddy the waters with some political agenda that shouldn't be part of this conversation. And we need to teach our students to be brave enough and have the courage enough to create that other group. And it doesn't need to have 50 participants. It needs 3 or 5 people who feel the same. And don't beg people to be accepted. Most likely you won't be. And if you are accepted, it's probably because you've had to sublimate a piece of your identity. And so you shouldn't want to be part of that organization to begin with. So I think that there are plenty of progressive causes that many of us care about, whether it relates to race, gender, sexuality, whatever it may be. And if those student groups want to exclude us, because they have a perception of our identity, forget them. Create your own group focused on the actual issues at hand and do the work about those issues, because you should not cede the space of the causes, but you don't need to be part of something that doesn't accept you fully for who you are.
That's a great answer, Rachel. Put another way, never miss an opportunity to use a crisis or a difficult situation to create a new opportunity, and you never know where that's going to lead. We unfortunately have run out of time. I want to add to everything that you have said, which has been so powerful and meaningful and important, by saying that none of us in this room is an expert in this issue. This is a very complex geopolitical issue, and I would venture to say that not all of you, particularly 16 or 17-year-olds, know exactly where you stand. And I think it is absolutely incumbent upon those of you who care enough to be educating yourselves before you, well, actually now, because I think you're engaged in those conversations today, and to figure out where you in fact stand, because we don't stand here to say that Israel is a perfect state, just like the United States, right? Rachel is not a perfect state, and we are entitled to criticize where we feel we need to criticize. We stand with Israel from the left, the right, and the conflicted center. And you are absolutely entitled to be exactly where you are, but you have to figure out where that is. And that only comes from knowledge and education. We'll be sending all of you today with a book. It's but one book, but we hope that you'll read it. We have lots more to tell you about before we part ways this afternoon. I'm going to thank you, Rachel, again for spending your time with us on a Sunday. You're awesome. We look forward to having you back many times in our community. To everyone in the room, now we're going to give you a 5-minute break. You have 2